The moment my daughter-in-law finally crossed the line at Thanksgiving dinner, I simply smiled, because 3 weeks earlier I had quietly signed the document that would change her life. The dining room smelled like roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and the sweet cinnamon of the pumpkin pies cooling on the kitchen counter. I had spent most of the afternoon preparing the meal, moving slowly but carefully through my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had cooked Thanksgiving dinner for nearly 40 years. The long oak table was set with my best china, the one with the thin gold trim my late husband Nathan had insisted we buy during a trip to Charleston decades ago. Outside the tall windows the November sky had already begun to darken, the last light of the day stretching across the backyard where the maple trees stood bare against the cold wind. My son Daniel sat at the far end of the table, scrolling through something on his phone while his wife Lindsay examined the dishes in front of her with the expression of someone inspecting a restaurant she had already decided to criticize. Lindsay had always carried herself with that air of quiet superiority, the kind that made every compliment sound like a favor and every complaint sound like a verdict. When she first married Daniel 6 years ago, I told myself she was simply young, ambitious, maybe a little impatient with tradition. But over the years I began to notice the small things. The way she spoke about people who worked for her. The way she described success as if it were a competition everyone else was losing. And most of all, the way she looked at me, as if I were a relic from a different era that she tolerated only because family required it. Daniel tried to keep the peace, of course. He always had. Even as a boy he hated conflict, preferring silence over confrontation, and that habit had followed him into adulthood. I watched him now as he finally set his phone down and reached for the gravy boat, his shoulders slightly hunched in that familiar posture that meant he was bracing for tension. Lindsay lifted her fork and tapped it lightly against the plate, studying the turkey as if it were an exhibit rather than dinner. The room felt unusually quiet for Thanksgiving. In past years Nathan would have been telling one of his long stories by now, usually about the early days of the company when everything we owned depended on a single contract and a lot of luck. But Nathan had been gone for 12 years, and the house had been quieter ever since. I poured a glass of iced tea and placed it beside Lindsay's plate, the ice cubes clinking softly against the glass. She barely glanced at it. Instead she leaned back in her chair and looked around the table as though evaluating the entire evening. The strange thing was that none of this surprised me. Not the tension, not the critical look in her eyes, not even the way Daniel avoided meeting my gaze. Because 3 weeks earlier Lindsay had walked into what she believed was the most exciting opportunity of her career, a management position at a rapidly growing logistics company with a salary that made her practically glow with pride when she talked about it. She had described the office, the interview, the impressive benefits package, and the way the hiring manager had told her she was exactly the kind of ambitious leader the company needed. She never once realized that the company she was so eager to impress had belonged to my family for over 30 years. She never knew that the final approval for every executive hire passed across my desk before any offer was sent. And she certainly never suspected that when I signed her employment letter, I already understood exactly the kind of lesson she would eventually need to learn. I watched her carefully now as she lifted a small piece of turkey and examined it with a slow shake of her head. The moment had finally arrived, exactly the way I had expected it would. And when it did, I simply smiled. Daniel finally cleared his throat and reached for the carving knife, slicing another piece of turkey with the careful politeness of someone trying to keep a peaceful evening from drifting into uncomfortable territory. The sound of the knife against the porcelain plate seemed louder than usual in the quiet dining room. I placed a spoonful of cranberry sauce beside his plate and noticed the way his eyes flicked briefly toward Lindsay before returning to his food, the silent signal he had been sending since he was 12 years old whenever he sensed tension building in the room. Lindsay, however, had never been particularly interested in quiet signals. She rested her elbows lightly on the edge of the table and studied the dishes in front of her as if they were items on a restaurant review she had already decided would be negative. The golden brown turkey, the bowl of mashed potatoes still steaming gently, the green beans with almonds I had prepared the way Nathan used to like them. She looked at each plate slowly, thoughtfully, as though she were weighing some private judgment that only she understood. I had seen that look before. Not only in my own home, but during several company meetings when ambitious young managers believed confidence was the same thing as authority. Lindsay had always admired that type of success. She liked impressive titles, elegant offices, and the quiet recognition that came when people assumed you had power. Over the past month she had talked about little else besides the new position she had secured at Whitmore Logistics. She had described the glass office building downtown, the spacious conference rooms, the generous salary package, and the management training program she would begin the following Monday. The number alone had impressed her. $180,000 a year, plus bonuses. I remembered the pride in her voice when she mentioned it the first time. She had repeated the figure twice during Sunday dinner the week before, just in case anyone at the table had not understood exactly how successful she believed she was becoming. Daniel had smiled politely and congratulated her, although he had never once mentioned the name of the company to me during those conversations. That detail alone told me he had not made the connection yet. My son knew the company by another name when he was growing up. To him it had always been simply the family business, the warehouse his father spent late nights managing and the trucks that occasionally rumbled down the driveway when he was still in high school. After Nathan passed away, Daniel moved away to build his own career in software consulting, far from freight schedules and shipping contracts. I never insisted that he return to the company, and over the years he seemed content to leave that chapter of his life behind. Lindsay, however, had discovered Whitmore Logistics through a recruitment firm, one of the aggressive headhunters that specialized in finding ambitious candidates for executive training roles. She had told us the story with great enthusiasm. The recruiter had called unexpectedly. The interview had gone wonderfully. The hiring manager had been impressed with her leadership potential. She repeated each detail with the careful excitement of someone describing the beginning of a very important future. The only part of the story she never questioned was the final signature at the bottom of the offer letter she proudly showed Daniel one evening in their living room. I had seen the document before she ever opened the envelope. The name printed beneath the company letterhead had been my own, written in the same neat signature I had been using for 27 years. As Lindsay lifted her fork again and examined another piece of turkey with a thoughtful frown, I felt the familiar calm settle in my chest. Some lessons do not arrive during interviews or training seminars. Sometimes they arrive quietly, at a dinner table, when people least expect them. I noticed the moment Lindsay decided the evening was not meeting her expectations. It was a small thing at first. A slight tilt of her head as she looked around the table. The quiet sigh she let out when Daniel placed another slice of turkey on her plate. Most people would not have noticed it, but after 6 years of watching her I had learned to recognize the early signs of one of her performances. Lindsay believed the world was divided into two types of people, those who impressed her and those who disappointed her. Unfortunately, family dinners often fell into the second category. She lifted her fork again and pressed lightly into the mashed potatoes, as though testing their texture. The movement was slow and deliberate. I poured myself a small glass of iced tea and waited. Across the table Daniel began talking about a new software contract his company had secured in Denver, explaining how his team would need to travel several times over the next few months. He spoke calmly, carefully, the way he always did when he sensed the mood in the room shifting. Lindsay nodded politely but did not seem to be listening. Her attention remained on the plate in front of her. I remembered the first Thanksgiving she spent with us. She had arrived wearing a cream-colored coat and carrying a bottle of imported wine that she placed on the table like a small trophy. That evening she spent most of dinner describing the consulting firm where she worked at the time, mentioning the office view, the clients she handled, the expensive restaurants where they hosted business meetings. Nathan had listened patiently and later whispered to me that she reminded him of a young manager who had once tried to impress a room full of truck drivers by explaining how supply chains worked. Nathan always had a gentle sense of humor about those things. Over the years Lindsay changed jobs 3 different times, each position slightly more impressive than the last, each departure explained with the same confident phrase. She said she was moving on to something bigger. Something more suited to her potential. Daniel supported her every time. He always believed that encouragement was the same as loyalty. I quietly supported her as well, although my reasons were different. Watching someone closely often reveals more than confronting them directly. Tonight the familiar pattern was returning. Lindsay set down her fork and leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful in a way that felt less like reflection and more like evaluation. Her eyes moved slowly across the table again, pausing briefly on the serving dishes. I could almost hear the unspoken comparison forming in her mind between the elegant restaurants she admired and the simple dinner sitting in front of her. Outside the wind rustled the dry branches of the maple trees, and the old clock in the hallway ticked steadily toward 8 o'clock. I reached for the gravy boat and poured a small amount over my potatoes, the rich brown sauce spreading slowly across the plate. Lindsay watched the movement with a faint crease in her brow, the kind of look someone gives when they are preparing to say something that they believe will establish authority. Daniel noticed it too. His shoulders tightened slightly as he set down his fork. For a moment the room held that quiet tension that appears just before a storm breaks across open water. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and waited, feeling the same calm certainty that had settled over me earlier in the evening. Some moments reveal a great deal about a person, not because of what happens to them, but because of how they choose to respond when the room becomes quiet enough for everyone to hear exactly what they have been thinking. The silence finally stretched long enough that even Daniel seemed to realize something was about to happen. Lindsay slowly placed her fork down beside her plate, the small clink of metal against porcelain echoing slightly in the quiet dining room. She leaned back in her chair and folded her arms with a thoughtful expression that might have looked calm to someone who did not know her very well. But I knew that expression. It was the same look she used when she was preparing to explain why a hotel room was unacceptable or why a restaurant had failed to meet her standards. Her eyes moved across the dishes again, pausing on the turkey, the mashed potatoes, the green beans, and the stuffing. I waited. Daniel shifted in his chair and cleared his throat softly, a nervous habit he had carried since childhood whenever he sensed that something uncomfortable was about to unfold. Lindsay picked up her napkin and dabbed the corner of her mouth, though she had barely taken a bite of anything on her plate. Then she let out a small breath that sounded almost theatrical in the quiet room. I had heard that breath before as well. It usually meant that a speech was coming. Daniel tried once more to keep the evening steady. He reached for the cranberry sauce and said something about how good the house smelled when he walked in earlier that afternoon. His voice was careful and hopeful, the way someone sounds when they are trying to redirect a conversation before it goes somewhere unpleasant. Lindsay did not respond to him. Instead she continued studying the plate in front of her as if it were a problem she needed to solve. Finally she shook her head slowly, the same way a restaurant critic might react after tasting something disappointing. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. She pushed the plate forward a few inches with her fingertips and glanced toward me with an expression that suggested she had reached a conclusion she could no longer keep to herself. For a moment no one spoke. The clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking each second of the quiet. I folded my hands loosely in my lap and watched her. Years of running a company had taught me that some people reveal far more about themselves when they believe they are the most confident person in the room. Lindsay believed that tonight. She had spent the past 3 weeks talking about her new position, about the impressive salary, about the future she imagined beginning on Monday morning when she would walk into that glass building downtown as a member of the management team. In her mind, she had already stepped into a new world where she expected to be taken seriously. Perhaps that confidence made this moment feel safe to her. Perhaps she believed that criticizing a Thanksgiving dinner was a small demonstration of the authority she thought she deserved. Whatever the reason, she finally spoke. Her voice carried the same sharp certainty I had heard many times before when she evaluated something she considered beneath her expectations. Daniel looked down at his plate immediately, already sensing the direction the evening was taking. I noticed the way his shoulders tightened again as Lindsay gestured lightly toward the food spread across the table. I could see the words forming in her mind even before she said them. It was not anger that filled the room in that moment. It was something quieter and far more revealing. It was the confidence of someone who believed that the person across the table had no real power to challenge her. I simply sat there, listening, knowing that in just a few minutes she would discover how wrong that assumption truly was. For a few seconds Lindsay did not speak. She simply looked at the table again with that thoughtful expression, as if she were giving everyone a final opportunity to notice the problem she believed was obvious. Then she leaned forward slightly and tapped the edge of her plate with the tip of her fork. The sound was light but deliberate, the way someone might signal that a meeting was about to begin. Daniel looked up for a moment and then quickly lowered his eyes again, already recognizing the tone that meant the evening was about to become uncomfortable. Lindsay glanced toward him briefly and then back at the dishes in front of her. I could see the small crease forming between her eyebrows, the same expression she often used when she believed she was about to deliver an honest opinion that other people were simply too polite to say out loud. She lifted the fork again and pressed it gently into the turkey before setting it back down without tasting it. Her voice, when it came, carried that smooth certainty that always suggested she believed she was helping improve a situation. She said that she could not understand why people still insisted on cooking meals like this when modern kitchens had access to so many better recipes. She gestured lightly toward the stuffing and said it looked dry. She mentioned that the mashed potatoes seemed heavy. Each comment arrived with the calm confidence of someone presenting a professional review rather than speaking to family at a holiday table. Daniel tried to smile politely and said that the food smelled wonderful to him. Lindsay did not seem to notice his attempt to soften the moment. Instead she leaned back again and crossed her arms as if evaluating the entire dinner from a distance. I watched her quietly, noticing the rhythm of the conversation the same way I would observe a negotiation across a conference table. There is always a moment when someone decides to press forward with an opinion they believe will establish authority. Lindsay had reached that moment. She shook her head slightly and said that when she hosted dinners in the future she would probably hire a professional caterer because it made more sense than spending hours preparing food that might not meet expectations. Her tone was calm but unmistakably dismissive. Daniel shifted in his chair again and reached for his glass of iced tea, though he did not take a sip. The clock in the hallway continued its steady ticking, filling the brief pauses between her sentences. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate and looked at her with the same quiet attention I used during executive meetings when a manager believed they were making an important point. Lindsay finished her small speech and waited for a response, clearly expecting someone to agree with her or at least acknowledge that she had made a reasonable observation. Daniel glanced toward me cautiously, the way a son sometimes looks at his mother when he is unsure which direction the conversation will turn. I simply lifted my glass and took a slow sip of iced tea. The calm expression on my face seemed to confuse Lindsay for a moment. Perhaps she expected irritation or embarrassment. Instead I gave her the same small smile I had worn earlier in the evening. It was the kind of smile that suggested patience rather than offense. The truth was that nothing she had said surprised me. People often reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are offering criticism that no one will challenge. Lindsay believed that tonight. She believed that this table was simply a quiet family gathering where her opinions carried more weight than anyone else's. What she did not realize was that the same calm patience she saw in my smile was the patience of someone who had spent decades watching people underestimate the room they were standing in. Daniel finally lifted his glass and took a slow sip of iced tea, the movement careful and deliberate, as if he hoped that a simple gesture might reset the atmosphere in the room. The ice clinked softly against the glass and then the sound faded back into the quiet of the dining room. Lindsay watched me for a moment longer, perhaps expecting a reaction that never arrived. When none came, she leaned forward again and adjusted the edge of her plate with her fingertips. It was a small movement, but it carried the unmistakable impatience of someone who believed her point had not yet been fully understood. She said that she did not mean to offend anyone, but she believed honesty was important in a family. According to her, successful people improve things by speaking openly rather than pretending everything was acceptable. Her tone suggested that she considered the statement generous advice rather than criticism. Daniel nodded faintly, although his eyes remained fixed on the tablecloth as though studying the woven pattern might somehow prevent the conversation from becoming more uncomfortable. I reached for the bowl of green beans and placed a small portion on my plate, moving slowly and carefully the way I always did during dinner. Lindsay watched the motion with visible disbelief, as if she could not understand how anyone could remain calm after hearing her evaluation. I could almost see the thought forming in her mind. She believed she had challenged the authority of the evening and expected either apology or irritation in return. Instead, she was receiving neither. She cleared her throat lightly and said that when she began working in her new management role on Monday, she would be responsible for improving operational standards across multiple departments. She mentioned the number again, the salary she had proudly shared earlier that week, and the way the hiring manager had described the position as a fast track into senior leadership. As she spoke, her confidence returned quickly. Success had always been her favorite subject. Daniel glanced up briefly when she mentioned the company name again, Whitmore Logistics, and I noticed the faint look of confusion that crossed his face for a moment before he pushed it aside. To him the name sounded familiar but distant, like a story from childhood he had not revisited in many years. Lindsay continued describing the impressive office building downtown, the modern conference rooms, and the executives she expected to meet during orientation. She spoke with the comfortable authority of someone who believed she was stepping into a world where her voice would carry weight from the first day forward. I listened quietly, folding my napkin once more and placing it beside my plate. The room had grown still again except for the faint ticking of the hallway clock and the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen beyond the doorway. When Lindsay finally finished speaking, she looked directly at me again with an expression that suggested she was waiting for acknowledgement. I gave her the same calm smile I had worn all evening. Then I asked a simple question in the same tone I might use during a company meeting when confirming a detail before a contract was finalized. I asked if her first day at the new job was scheduled for Monday morning. Lindsay nodded immediately, clearly pleased that the conversation had turned back toward her success. She said yes, orientation began at 9 o'clock sharp and she intended to arrive early to make a strong impression. I held her gaze for a moment longer and gently set my glass back on the table. The small circle of moisture beneath it spread slowly across the polished wood surface. I had spent decades watching people walk confidently into situations they believed they fully understood. It was never the moment of confidence that interested me. It was the moment just afterward, when the room quietly revealed how much they had overlooked. For a moment Lindsay looked pleased with herself, the way people do when they believe a conversation has finally moved onto ground where they feel superior. She picked up her glass of sparkling water and took a slow sip, watching me carefully over the rim as if waiting for the admiration she thought the situation deserved. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair again, his fingers resting uneasily beside his plate. The room had grown quiet in that particular way that sometimes happens during family dinners when everyone senses that the evening has turned in a direction no one quite expected. I folded my hands loosely on the table and looked at Lindsay with the same calm attention I had used in countless boardroom meetings over the years. Then I nodded once, slowly. I told her that arriving early on the first day of work was always a good idea. Punctuality made a strong first impression. Lindsay smiled at that, clearly satisfied that I had finally acknowledged something she said with approval. She began explaining that the recruiter had told her the management training program was extremely competitive and that the executives who ran the company expected nothing but the highest standards. She mentioned the building again, the one downtown with the tall glass windows that reflected the skyline every afternoon. She described the orientation meeting where the new hires would meet the leadership team and learn about the company structure. As she spoke I noticed Daniel's expression slowly changing. The confusion from earlier had returned, and this time it lingered longer. His eyes lifted toward me for a brief second, the same questioning look he used to give his father years ago whenever something did not quite make sense. I simply reached toward the side table beside my chair where my phone rested. The movement was quiet and unhurried, the kind of motion that would barely attract attention in most rooms. But Lindsay noticed it immediately. Her voice slowed slightly as she watched me unlock the screen. I did not interrupt her explanation. I simply opened my email and scrolled for a moment until I found the message I had reviewed several weeks earlier. The subject line still read employment offer confirmation. I turned the phone gently so the screen faced across the table. Lindsay stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her eyes moved down to the display where the company letterhead sat clearly at the top of the message. Beneath it were the lines outlining her new role, the starting salary, and the orientation date she had proudly mentioned so many times during the past week. Daniel leaned forward slightly to see the screen as well. Then Lindsay's attention reached the bottom of the message where the final approval signature appeared. For a brief second the room seemed to grow even quieter than before. The hallway clock continued its steady ticking somewhere behind us. I rested the phone lightly against the edge of the table so both of them could see it clearly. The signature line read Margaret Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer, Whitmore Logistics. Lindsay stared at the screen as if the words had appeared in a language she did not recognize. Daniel looked from the phone to my face and back again, the realization slowly forming behind his eyes. I picked up my glass of iced tea and took a small sip before placing it down again. Then I looked at Lindsay with the same patient expression I had worn all evening and gently reminded her that Monday morning was only 4 days away. For several seconds Lindsay did not move. Her eyes remained fixed on the phone screen as if she expected the signature at the bottom of the message to change into something more reasonable. The confidence that had filled her voice only moments earlier seemed to dissolve quietly in the still air of the dining room. Daniel leaned closer to the table and read the signature again, this time more slowly, as though his mind was rearranging a memory he had not visited in years. I watched both of them with the same calm patience I had practiced throughout my career. It is a useful habit when running a company. People often reveal their true character not when they believe they are winning, but when they suddenly realize the situation is different than they imagined. Lindsay finally lifted her eyes from the screen and looked at me. The expression on her face had changed completely. The certainty was gone. In its place was the careful confusion of someone trying to rebuild a picture that had just shattered. She opened her mouth slightly, then closed it again before any words came out. Daniel spoke first, though his voice sounded quieter than usual. He said my name slowly, as if he was confirming something he already suspected but had never thought to ask directly. I nodded once and gently turned the phone back toward myself before setting it beside my plate again. The motion was simple and unhurried. Lindsay looked from me to Daniel and back again, her thoughts clearly racing through the conversations she had repeated so confidently over the past several weeks. She had talked about the recruiter. She had described the interviews. She had explained how impressed the hiring manager had been with her leadership potential. But she had never once mentioned meeting the chief executive officer. That detail had simply never crossed her mind as important. I rested my hands lightly on the table and looked at her with the same steady expression I had used all evening. Then I told her that Whitmore Logistics had been part of our family for more than 3 decades. I explained that Nathan and I had built the company together long before the glass office building downtown was ever constructed. Daniel listened quietly as I spoke, the memories clearly returning to him now. When he was younger he used to ride along in one of the delivery trucks during the summer just to see how the warehouses operated. After Nathan passed away, I continued running the company the same way we always had, one careful decision at a time. Lindsay remained silent while she listened, her earlier confidence replaced by a thoughtful stillness. I did not raise my voice or criticize anything she had said earlier in the evening. There was no need. The information itself was enough. Finally I looked back toward her and asked whether she still planned to arrive early on Monday morning. My tone was calm and professional, exactly the same tone I would use when speaking to any new member of the management team. Lindsay nodded slowly, though the movement seemed almost automatic. The hallway clock ticked again, marking the quiet seconds that followed. I lifted my glass of iced tea and took another small sip before setting it back on the table. Then I told her that orientation for new managers always began with a meeting in the executive conference room on the 10th floor. I added that I usually arrived a few minutes early to welcome new employees personally. The room fell silent once more, but this time the silence carried a very different weight. No one reached for their food after that. The plates remained exactly where they were, the steam from the turkey slowly fading into the cooler air of the room. Lindsay sat very still, her eyes lowered. For a moment as if she were replaying every word she had spoken earlier that evening. The confidence that had once filled the room now felt distant, like a loud conversation that had already ended. Daniel leaned back in his chair and rubbed his hand lightly across his forehead. The look on his face was not anger. It was the quiet realization of someone remembering pieces of the past that suddenly made sense again. I had seen that expression before on young managers when they understood that the meeting they thought they were leading was actually being observed more carefully than they realized. Lindsay finally lifted her eyes again. She glanced toward the dishes on the table and then toward me, her expression far more thoughtful than it had been earlier in the evening. For a moment it seemed as though she might say something, but instead she simply nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a fact that could not be argued away. Daniel cleared his throat gently and reached for the bowl of mashed potatoes again. The movement was hesitant at first, but then he served himself a small portion and offered the bowl quietly in Lindsay's direction. She looked at it for a second and then accepted the spoon without speaking. The simple motion seemed to release the tension that had been holding the room still for the past several minutes. I unfolded my napkin again and placed it across my lap before reaching for the gravy boat. Outside the window the night had settled fully over the yard, and the reflection of the dining room lights now glowed softly against the glass. The maple branches swayed gently in the wind, tapping lightly against the window frame. Lindsay took a small bite of the potatoes and sat quietly for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than before. She said that Monday morning would be arriving sooner than she expected. I nodded once and told her that the first day in a new position always felt that way. New environments have a habit of revealing things quickly. Daniel looked between the two of us, clearly relieved that the conversation had settled into something calmer. The hallway clock chimed softly as it marked the next hour, the sound echoing faintly through the house Nathan and I had shared for so many years. I lifted my glass once more and took a slow sip of iced tea. The evening had turned quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. It was not the tense silence from earlier. It was the reflective pause that sometimes follows a lesson people were not expecting to receive. Lindsay glanced at the dishes on the table once more and then back toward me. I gave her the same small, steady smile I had offered all evening. Then I raised my glass slightly and wished everyone a peaceful Thanksgiving. No one argued with that. The rest of the meal continued quietly, the conversation returning to ordinary topics like travel plans and the cold weather moving in from the north. But as the clock continued its steady ticking and the plates slowly emptied, I noticed that Lindsay listened far more carefully than she had before. Some lessons arrive loudly, but the most lasting ones often arrive in silence, when a person suddenly understands the room they are standing in.